Try it sometime. Sit down on your couch in the middle of the afternoon with nothing to do, no phone, no plan, nothing you're supposed to be finishing. Within about 90 seconds, something will start to itch, a low, nagging discomfort, a voice that says, you should be doing something. You'll reach for your phone or stand up or invent a small task just to make the feeling stop. Almost nobody can sit and do genuinely nothing for more than a few minutes without guilt creeping in. This feels like it must be human nature, like there's something built into us that punishes idleness. But that turns out to be almost completely wrong, and the real story is much more interesting. Because the guilt you feel doing nothing isn't ancient. It is an instinct. Somebody put it there, and we can trace almost exactly when. Let's start with the people who should have felt this guilt the most and didn't feel it at all. For most of human history, our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. The common assumption is that their lives were a brutal, exhausting struggle for survival, every waking hour spent scraping for food. In 1966, the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins presented research that overturned this completely. Studying groups like the Kung of the Kalahari and Aboriginal Australians, he found something nobody expected. These people worked, on average, about 15 to 20 hours a week to meet all their needs. The rest of the time, they rested. They talked and napped and sat around doing nothing in particular. Sahlins called them the original affluent society, not because they had a lot of things, but because they had a lot of time, and they felt no shame about how they spent it. A hunter who had brought back enough meat would simply stop and relax for days, sometimes longer, until the food ran low. Nobody stood over him asking why he wasn't being productive. The idea that a person should be busy all the time would have struck him as bizarre, maybe even insane. So, if our deepest ancestors rested freely and felt nothing about it, where did the guilt come from? The answer begins with religion. In the 16th and 17th centuries, a particular set of ideas spread across Europe, and the sociologist Max Weber gave them their famous name, the Protestant work ethic. The core idea was that hard work was not just useful, but morally good. Idleness wasn't merely unproductive. It became a sin. To waste time was to insult God, who had given you that time to use. Work became a sign of virtue, and rest became a sign of weakness, or worse, of moral failure. This was a genuinely new idea in human history. For thousands of years before, work was simply something you did to live. Now it became something you did to prove you were good. The seed of the guilt you feel on your couch was planted there, in those few centuries, by people trying to be holy. But the seed needed something to grow in, and then came the machine that would feed it for the next 300 years. When the Industrial Revolution arrived, it did something to time that had never been done before. It put a price on it. In a factory, you were paid by the hour. Your time was no longer just your time. It had become money, measured by a clock on the wall, owned by someone else during your shift. And the moment time became money, an entirely new concept came into existence. The concept of wasting it. Before the factory clock, a person who sat under a tree for an hour had simply sat under a tree for an hour. After the factory clock, that same person had wasted an hour, lost something with a value attached to it. The historian E.P. Thompson documented how factory owners drilled this new sense of time into workers with bells, fines, locked gates, and clocks everywhere. Over a few generations, an idea that started in the factory crept into people's bones. Time was a resource, and resting was spending it on nothing. And here's the part that explains why the guilt feels so personal, so internal, like it's coming from inside you rather than from history. The factory needed a foreman, someone to watch the workers, make sure they weren't slacking, push them to keep going. But you don't have a foreman standing behind your couch. So who is doing the watching now? You are. Somewhere along the way, the supervisor moved inside. We took the figure who used to stand over us with a clock and a clipboard, and we installed him in our own heads. Now when you sit down to rest, the voice that tells you to get up and be productive isn't your boss. It's you, supervising yourself, on behalf of a factory that closed down 100 years ago. This is what modern productivity culture is built on. The endless advice about optimizing your morning, maximizing your output, never wasting a minute. It all rests on a single inherited assumption that most people never question: the assumption that your worth as a person is equal to what you produce. That if you are not making something, earning something, or improving something, you are failing at being a human being. Your hunter-gatherer ancestor would not have understood this for a second. But there is a final layer to all of this, and it might be the most important one. Because while you sit there feeling guilty for doing nothing, your brain is doing something extraordinary, and the guilt is interrupting it. For a long time, neuroscientists assumed that when a person was resting, doing nothing, staring into space, the brain was mostly switched off. In 2001, a researcher named Marcus Raschel at Washington University discovered that the opposite was true. When you stop focusing on a task and let your mind drift, a whole network of brain regions lights up and becomes intensely active. He called it the default mode network. It is the brain's resting state, and it is anything but idle. The default mode network is where your brain does some of its most essential work. It consolidates the day's experiences into long-term memory, sorts out your sense of who you are and how you relate to other people, and feeds the kind of loose connective thinking that creativity and problem-solving depend on. This is why your best ideas so often arrive in the shower, on a walk, or just as you're falling asleep, in the moments when you finally stop trying, when you do nothing. So the rest you feel guilty about is not the absence of important work. It is some of the most important work your brain ever does. When you refuse to let yourself rest, when you fill every quiet moment with a screen or a task, you are not being more productive. You are interrupting the exact process that consolidates your memory, sorts your thoughts, and generates your best ideas. The guilt is fighting the recovery. The supervisor in your head is standing over the one part of you that needs the break the most, telling it to get back to work. Think about what has actually happened here. Your earliest ancestors rested freely and felt no shame. Then, over a few hundred years, a religious idea made rest a sin, a factory turned time into currency, and a culture tied your worth to your output. The guilt you feel doing nothing was assembled piece by forces that had nothing to do with your well-being and everything to do with keeping people working. It isn't your conscience, and it isn't human nature. It's a clock that someone installed in your nervous system, ticking on behalf of an owner you never agreed to serve. The next time you sit down with nothing to do and that familiar itch begins, the voice telling you to get up, that you should be doing something, that this is somehow wrong, you might pause for a second and ask where that voice actually came from, because it isn't yours. It was given to you. And the body sitting on that couch, doing nothing, feeling like a criminal, is doing exactly what every human did for hundreds of thousands of years, without ever once apologizing for it. You are not being lazy. You are resting, the way your species always did, before someone convinced you that you needed permission.